The light of dawn in Copper Ridge was a thief. It stole the color from the high desert sky, bleeding it out from indigo to a pale, dusty blue, and it stole the silence of the night, replacing it with the restless stirring of a town that mistook its own noise for importance. Inside the cavernous barn, at the edge of Thaddeus Crane's property, the light was a physical substance, cutting through the high, shattered window panes in solid, hazy shafts filled with the swirling ghosts of hay dust and chaff. It smelled of old wood, sweet rot, horse sweat, and the deep, earthy comfort of manure. For Ayanna Two Eagles, it was the smell of a chosen purgatory, a place of quiet labor where the ghosts of his past were, for a time, kept at bay by the simple, repetitive honesty of the work. He stood in the center of the main aisle, a man of 45 years, who looked both older and younger than his age. His face was a map of his life, carved by sun and sorrow, the high cheekbones and strong jaw of his Lakota and Cheyenne ancestors, overlaid with a weariness that belonged to no single people, but to all men who had seen too much of the world's true machinery. His hair, still thick and black as a raven's wing, was tied back with a simple leather thong. He wore the clothes of a hired hand, worn denim, a faded cotton shirt, scuffed boots, and they fit him like a second, ill-fitting skin. His stillness was profound, an island of calm in the swirling, mote-filled light. He was mending a leather harness, his long, scarred fingers moving with a surgeon's precision, each pass of the needle and thread a small, deliberate prayer. The horses in their stalls rustled and blew softly, their great dark eyes fixed on him, sensing the deep well of tranquility that resided within the man. They, unlike the men of this town, judged a being by its essence, not its station. Ayanna had been in Copper Ridge for almost 2 years, a ghost hiding in plain sight. He had drifted here after the last treaty, his heart heavy with the ink and lies, the broken promises that tasted like ash in his mouth. He had been a chief scout for the United States Army, a bridge between two worlds, and for his service in the war against the Kiowa, they had given him a medal. He kept it wrapped in soft doeskin at the bottom of his worn saddlebag, a circle of bronze and blue ribbon that felt heavier than any stone. He had walked in the halls of power in Washington, spoken with generals and senators, his words weighed and measured. His counsel had saved lives on both sides of the conflict. He spoke English, Spanish, Lakota, Cheyenne, and enough Apache to make peace, and had once surprised a visiting dignitary by quoting Seneca in the original Latin. But here, in Copper Ridge, he was just the Indian, a faceless, nameless convenience. He answered to Chief or Geronimo, or most often nothing at all. He had chosen this anonymity. He had sought this silence. But he had not anticipated the casual cruelty that came with it, a daily acid that threatened to dissolve the peace he was trying so hard to build. The heavy barn doors groaned open, scraping against the hard-packed dirt floor and flooding the space with the harsh, horizontal light of the morning sun. 3 figures filled the entrance, their long shadows stretching out before them like accusations. Thaddeus Crane stood in the middle, a man whose physical stature was inflated by his wealth. He was barrel-chested, with a florid face and small, suspicious eyes. He owned the town's mercantile, the saloon, and the loyalty of men who feared his influence. To his right was Dutch Morrison, a lanky, stoop-shouldered man with a perpetual sneer etched onto his thin lips. To his left, Samuel Pike, broad and slow-witted, a creature of simple appetites and borrowed prejudices, his knuckles thick from a lifetime of following orders. "Well, look at him!" Crane boomed, his voice echoing in the high rafters. "Busy as a bee in a tar bucket." Ayanna did not look up. He continued his stitching, his movements fluid and unbroken. His heart rate did not quicken. He had faced down charging cavalry, stared into the eyes of starving warriors, and sat across from men who could order the death of thousands with a single word. The blustering of a small-town tyrant was less than the buzz of a fly. He had learned long ago that the truest power was silence. Silence was a mirror, and men like Crane could not bear to see their own reflection. "I'm talking to you, Chief," Crane said, his voice sharpening. He strode forward, his expensive boots kicking up puffs of dust. Pike and Morrison flanked him, smirking. They were a pack, and their courage was a shared, pathetic thing. Ayanna finished a stitch, pulled it tight, and slowly, deliberately, raised his eyes. They were the color of dark, wet earth after a rain, and they held no fear, no anger, only a vast, empty patience. "Mr. Crane," he said, his voice quiet and low, the sound of stones rolling in a deep riverbed. "Don't you Mr. Crane me," Crane spat. "I've been looking over my ledgers. Feed costs are up, way up, and I see you, with your fat, happy horses in here." He gestured dismissively at the stalls. "I pay you to look after my stock, not to run a damn charity for every stray nag you find." He was referring to the old mare in the last stall, a sway-backed creature with a cloudy eye that Ayanna had bought from a traveling tinker for $1, saving her from the glue factory. He fed her from his own small wages, but Crane saw everything as his. "She eats little, sir," Ayanna said, his voice even. "She is no trouble. She's trouble because I say she's trouble." Crane's face was reddening, a storm gathering in his fleshy cheeks. He enjoyed this performance of power. It was his morning ritual, a way to affirm his place in the world by stepping on the man he perceived to be at the bottom of it. "You think you can just do as you please? On my land? In my barn?" Dutch Morrison sidled closer. "He thinks a lot of things, Thad. Thinks he's better'n us with his quiet act." "Got that right," Pike grunted, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice that landed dangerously close to Ayanna's boot. Ayanna's gaze remained on Crane. He did not acknowledge the other two. They were merely echoes of the man in the center. To engage with them would be to validate them. He held his silence, a shield they could not penetrate. This infuriated Crane more than any backtalk could. He needed a reaction, a flinch, a spark of anger to justify his own. "I asked you a question, damn you," Crane said, stepping so close that Ayanna could smell the sour whiskey on his breath. "I do the work I am paid for," Ayanna replied, his voice still low, but with an edge of finality that a keener man would have recognized. "Your horses are fed and groomed. The stalls are clean. The barn is maintained." "It's not maintained enough!" Crane roared, his frustration boiling over. He looked around wildly, his eyes landing on a large bucket of oats Ayanna had just filled. It was for Crane's prize stallion, a magnificent black creature that Ayanna cared for with a respect that transcended its owner. With a sudden, savage movement, Crane kicked the bucket. It flew across the aisle, hitting the far wall with a loud clang. Golden oats sprayed across the dusty floor, a cascade of wasted effort, a shower of casual contempt. The scattered grains settled in the shafts of light, each tiny husk illuminated, a symbol of the thoughtless, profligate cruelty of the man who had kicked it. The horses shied in their stalls, their nostrils flaring. Ayanna's eyes followed the trajectory of the bucket. He looked at the spilled grain, then back at Crane. His face was a mask of stoic calm, but inside him, a cold, old anger stirred. It was not the anger of a hot-blooded youth, but the deep, glacial rage of a man who had spent his life fighting against this very brand of stupid, wasteful arrogance. The ignorance that started wars, the prejudice that starved children. He had seen this act 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways. A treaty ignored, a ration shipment lost, a sacred site desecrated. It was always the same, the powerful kicking over the bucket just to watch the powerless clean it up. "There," Crane said, breathing heavily, his chest puffed out. "Now it's not maintained. Clean it up. And get that broken-down horse of yours out of my barn by nightfall, or I'll put a bullet in it myself." Pike and Morrison chuckled, their laughter harsh and ugly in the suddenly quiet barn. Ayanna's gaze was unblinking. He looked at Crane's face, at the smug satisfaction twisting his lips. He saw not a man, but a symbol. He saw the rot at the heart of this town, and so many others. He had come here seeking peace, but he was beginning to understand that peace could not be found by simply hiding from the world. Sometimes the world came for you. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Yes, sir, he said. The words were obedience, but the tone was something else entirely. It was the sound of a great weight settling, of a decision being made. He would clean up the grain. He would tend to the horses. He would do his job. But something had shifted. The quiet endurance was still there, but now it had a purpose. It was no longer just about survival. It was about waiting. Crane, satisfied with his dominance, turned on his heel. See that you do, he grunted over his shoulder. The three of them swaggered out of the barn, their laughter trailing behind them, leaving Ayana alone in the dusty, sun-streaked silence, with the scattered grain at his feet. He stood there for a long moment, the harness forgotten in his hands. He looked at the mess, the monument to their petty hatred. He closed his eyes, and for a second, he was not in a barn in Copper Ridge. He was on the plains of the Llano Estacado, the wind whispering through the tall grass, the scent of sage and distance in the air. He was with his mentors, men of profound dignity like Quanah Parker and Satanta, men who understood that a man's worth was measured by the truth in his heart and the strength of his spirit, not the color of his skin or the jingle of coin in his pocket. He remembered the weight of responsibility, the burden of leadership, and he remembered the promise he had made to himself to live a life of peace, but never, ever, to surrender his soul. He opened his eyes. The barn was just a barn again. He bent down, not with the stoop of a servant, but with the deliberate grace of a man performing a necessary task. He found a broom and a dustpan. As he began to sweep the scattered oats, each stroke was measured, patient. He was not just cleaning a floor. He was biding his time. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and the quiet rhythm of his work filled the space, a silent vow against the encroaching darkness. The storm was coming. He could feel it in the air, in the stillness of the day. But it was not a storm he would run from. It was a storm he had been born to face. The sweeping was a meditation. Each pass of the straw bristles across the wooden planks was a line of a silent prayer, a drawing together of scattered thoughts. The dust motes danced in the light, each one a memory, a face, a voice, a promise made, a promise broken. He worked his way across the barn floor, his movements economical, wasting no energy, a habit learned from long marches and scant rations. The wastefulness of the kicked bucket was an offense to his very core. Grain was life. To spill it for sport was a blasphemy against the earth itself. He thought of the two Apache men who had ridden into Copper Ridge a month ago. He had been shoeing one of Crane's geldings when they appeared, their ponies lean and tough from the trail. They were not warriors. They were scouts, emissaries. One was a man of some years, his face a testament to dignity and hardship, Chief Standing Bear. The other was his nephew, young, his eyes bright with a cautious hope. They had come not with weapons drawn, but with a request. Their people, pushed south by the relentless pressure of settlers and blue-coated soldiers, were in a bad way. The hunting grounds were barren, the government rations late, if they were coming at all. They needed to trade for grain, not a handout, a trade. They had good hides, finely beaded work. Ayana had watched from the shadows of the smithy as Thaddeus Crane, flanked by Morrison and Pike, met them in the center of the dusty street. He could not hear the words, but he could read the language of bodies, a dialect he knew better than any spoken tongue. He saw the quiet, pleading dignity of Standing Bear, the arrogant, dismissive gestures of Crane. He saw Crane laugh, a loud, ugly sound that carried on the wind. He saw Pike spit on the ground near the Apache leader's feet. He saw the young nephew's hand clench, and the older man place a restraining hand on his arm. The refusal was absolute, contemptuous. The Apaches had turned their ponies and ridden away, their backs straight, their departure radiating an offense that was deeper and more dangerous than any shouted threat. Ayana knew what that kind of insult would do. It would curdle hope into bitterness, and bitterness into a righteous, desperate fury. Men would not watch their children starve, while men like Crane used grain for sport. The refusal to trade was not just a denial of commerce, it was a declaration. It said, "Your lives have no value. Your hunger means nothing. You are not human to us." And when you tell a man he is not human, you cannot be surprised when he shows you the beast you have created. Ayanna had seen it happen a dozen times, a spark of prejudice fanning the flames of conflict until it became a wildfire that consumed everything in its path. Crane, in his blind arrogance, had just thrown a lit match into a canyon full of dry tinder. He finished sweeping the last of the oats into the dustpan and carefully poured them back into the bucket. He would not feed this to the horses. The dirt and splinters would sicken them, but he would not throw it away either. He would use it for the wild birds. Nothing was wasted. That was the law of the world he came from. The day wore on. The sun baked the valley, and the air grew thick and still. Ayanna moved through his chores with the same deliberate pace. He curried the horses, their muscles quivering under his knowing hands. He spoke to them in a low mix of Lakota and English, his voice a soothing rumble. He cleaned the stalls, forked fresh hay, filled the water troughs. The work was hard, physical, grounding. It kept the memories at a manageable distance. Yet the sense of imminence grew stronger with each passing hour, a tension in the air, a watchfulness in the way the birds had fallen silent. The world was holding its breath. Around midday, a rider came into town, his horse lathered and near collapse. He shouted of smoke on the horizon to the south, of a ranch burned to the ground, of a family missing. The news spread through Copper Ridge like a fever. Men gathered in the street, their faces pale with a fear they tried to mask with bluster and bravado. They spoke of savages and war parties, their voices loud and uncertain. They gathered around Crane outside his mercantile, looking to him for answers, for reassurance. He stood on the boardwalk, his chest puffed out, proclaiming that Copper Ridge was safe, that no band of renegades would dare attack a town so well defended. But his eyes darted nervously toward the southern horizon. Ayanna watched from the barn doorway, unseen. He knew this fear. It was the fear of consequence, the fear of a bill coming due. The people of Copper Ridge had lived in a comfortable bubble of perceived superiority, and the world was now threatening to prick that bubble with the sharp point of a lance. Late afternoon brought a change. It wasn't the dust devil of a lone rider. It was a low, distant rumble, a vibration felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. It was the sound of thunder, but the sky was a perfect, cloudless blue. Ayanna stopped his work, his head cocked. He had heard that sound before. It was not thunder, it was the sound of shod hooves, many of them. Moving at a steady, disciplined pace, it was the sound of the United States cavalry. He stepped out of the barn's shadow into the full, hot glare of the sun, wiping his hands on a rag. His eyes, accustomed to the dim interior, narrowed as he scanned the road leading into town from the east, the direction of Fort Grant. The rumble grew louder, resolving into the distinct, rhythmic beat of a troop on the move. A column of blue-coated soldiers, at least 2 full companies, appeared over the rise, their guidons snapping in the faint breeze. At their head rode a cluster of officers, their forms wavering in the heat haze. The townspeople, already agitated, spilled out of the saloon and the mercantile, their fear now mixed with a confusing sense of relief. The army was here. They were safe. Thaddeus Crane pushed his way to the forefront, composing his face into a mask of civic welcome. He was the town's leader. It was his place to greet the commanding officer. He straightened his waistcoat and prepared to assert his importance. The column rode into town without slowing, their discipline a stark contrast to the scattered, anxious mob of civilians. The horses were tired but well cared for, the men dusty and grim-faced. They were not on a parade march. They were on serious business. The lead officer held up a hand, and the entire column came to a halt with a jangle of bridles and a sigh of leather. The sudden silence was more intimidating than the noise had been. The officer at the front was a man in his late 50s, with a trim gray mustache and eyes the color of a winter sky. He sat his horse with an easy, ramrod straightness that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle. A colonel's eagles glinted on his shoulder straps. He was a man accustomed to command, his presence radiating an authority that made Crane's bluster look like a child's tantrum. Colonel Marcus Whitfield's gaze swept over the town, taking in the dusty street, the false-fronted buildings, the nervous faces of the citizens. His eyes passed over Thaddeus Crane without a flicker of recognition, dismissing him as part of the scenery. Crane, who had taken a step forward with a welcoming smile plastered on his face, froze, the smile faltering. He was being ignored. It was an experience so foreign to him that he could not immediately process it. Whitfield's gaze continued its sweep, searching, methodical. He was looking for someone. The tension in the street ratcheted up a notch. Pike and Morrison, standing behind Crane, exchanged a confused glance. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Important men were supposed to acknowledge other important men. Then the colonel's eyes found the figure standing quietly by the barn. His relentless, searching gaze stopped, and it locked onto Ayanna. For a long moment, the two men just looked at each other across the dusty expanse. In that shared gaze, a universe of experience was exchanged. Years of shared campaigns, of councils of war held in smoky tents, of hard-won respect forged in the crucible of battle and diplomacy. Whitfield's stern expression softened, not into a smile, but into something deeper, recognition, relief, and a profound, unshakable respect. Ayanna gave a slow, minute nod. It was the barest acknowledgement, but it was enough. He was no longer hiding. The world had found him. Colonel Whitfield swung down from his horse with a fluid motion that belied his age. He handed the reins to a subordinate without looking. He ignored the sputtering Crane, who had again tried to step forward and introduce himself. Whitfield walked with a purpose that parted the crowd of townspeople like a ship's prow through water. They fell back, their mouths agape, watching as this high-ranking, formidable officer strode directly, unerringly, toward the Barnhand, toward the Indian. Crane watched, his face a mask of utter bewilderment. His world, a carefully constructed hierarchy with himself at the apex, was beginning to tilt on its axis. Why was this man, this symbol of federal power and military might, walking past him? Why was he heading for that lazy, insolent worker? It made no sense. The gears in his mind ground together, trying to reconcile the scene with his understanding of reality, and failing completely. Dutch Morrison's sneer had vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion. Pike just stared, his simple brain unable to form a coherent thought. The entire town held its breath, a collective witness to a silent, baffling drama. The colonel stopped a few feet from Ayanna. He stood for a moment, his gaze taking in the worn clothes, the calloused hands, the deep, quiet dignity that no amount of filth or subservience could hide. He saw the man he had known, the man he had ridden with, the man whose wisdom had saved his command more than once. Then, in a gesture that sent a shockwave through the assembled crowd, Colonel Marcus Whitfield, commander of the 3rd Cavalry, a man who answered only to generals, removed his hat. He held it in his hand, a gesture of profound deference. The dust of the trail was on the brim, but the authority it represented was pristine. And in the stunned, absolute silence of the Copper Ridge afternoon, he spoke. His voice was clear, crisp, and filled with an emotion that no one present could have anticipated. "Ayanna," he said, the name itself a revelation, spoken with a familiarity that was both intimate and deeply respectful. "It's been too long." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "Sir," he added, the word landing with the force of a physical blow. "It is an honor to see you again." The world did not crack, it shattered. The single word, "sir," hung in the hot, still air like a bullet suspended in time. It was an impossibility, a tear in the fabric of the universe as Thaddeus Crane knew it. His mind, which had been stumbling in confusion, came to a dead halt. The colonel, this embodiment of white military authority, had just addressed the Barnhand, the nameless dirty Indian, as Sir. Not only that, but he had removed his hat. It was a gesture of respect so profound, so utterly out of place in the context of Copper Ridge's rigid social order, that it simply did not compute. Crane's jaw, which had been working to form an introduction, went slack. His florid face, usually red with arrogance, paled to a pasty mottled gray. He looked from the colonel to Ayanna and back again, his eyes wide with a disbelief so complete it bordered on panic. This was wrong. All wrong. The stable boy, the man he had just humiliated, the man whose wages he withheld and whose existence he barely tolerated, was being treated with more deference than a visiting governor would receive. Beside him, Dutch Morrison's lanky frame seemed to shrink. The sneer was gone, wiped clean from his face, leaving behind a raw, naked bewilderment. He physically recoiled, as if the scene were a blast of heat. Samuel Pike, ever the follower, looked at Crane for guidance, but for the first time, he found no answers there. Crane's face was a blank slate of shock. Pike's simple world of strong and weak, of us and them, had been turned upside down and shaken until all the pieces fell out. The rest of the townspeople murmured, a low, confused sound that rippled through the crowd. They were witnessing the public demolition of a worldview they had all shared, a worldview that had just been proven to be a catastrophic miscalculation. Ayanna stood motionless for a beat, letting the colonel's words settle over the crowd. He felt their shock, their confusion. It was a bitter, necessary medicine. Then, something within him shifted. It was not a sudden change, but the slow, deliberate unfolding of something that had been tightly furled for 2 long years. The stoop in his shoulders, the slight protective curve of his spine that he had adopted as the uniform of the subservient, straightened. He rose to his full height, and it was as if he grew 6 inches. The years of weariness seemed to fall away from his face, replaced by an ancient, quiet authority. The Barnhand vanished, and in his place stood a leader of men. The transformation was so complete, so profound, that he seemed an entirely different person. He was no longer a man hiding from his past. He was a man reclaiming it. He inclined his head slightly toward the colonel, a gesture of respect between equals. "Marcus," he said, his voice changing. The low Riverstone rumble was still there, but it was now imbued with a new resonance. It was clearer, more articulate, the voice of a man accustomed to speaking and being heard, a voice that carried the weight of command and the precision of a diplomat. "Your timing has always been impeccable." The crowd gasped. He knew the colonel's first name, the intimacy of it, the casual ease, was another blow to their crumbling reality. Colonel Whitfield allowed himself a small, grim smile. "I wish the circumstances were better. We have a fire on our hands, Ayanna, a big one, and your name was the first one that came up in council." Crane, finally finding his voice, sputtered, His name? What is this? What's going on here? This man works for me. He's a Barnhand." The words came out high-pitched, desperate. He was trying to reassert his reality, to put the world back into the box he had built for it. The colonel turned his head slowly, fixing Crane with a gaze as cold and hard as granite. He didn't speak to him directly, but addressed the air in front of him, as if Crane were a piece of furniture. "This man," he said, his voice dripping with contempt, "is Ayanna Two Eagles." The name meant nothing to the townspeople, but the way Whitfield said it, with a reverence usually reserved for founding fathers or legendary generals, gave it an immense gravity. "He was chief of scouts for the entire 3rd Cavalry Division under General Crook," Whitfield continued, his voice rising, each fact a hammer blow against the walls of their ignorance. "His strategies in the 78 campaign saved more of my men than I can count. He has advised 3 generals, 2 territorial governors, and a congressional committee. He speaks 5 languages, not including the Queen's English, which he speaks with more eloquence than any man in this dusty excuse for a town." Whitfield took a step closer to Ayanna, his eyes still burning with a righteous fire on behalf of his friend. And for his valor at the Battle of Palo Duro Canyon, where he rode under heavy fire to rescue 3 wounded troopers pinned down by Kiowa rifles, he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. A collective, audible intake of breath swept through the crowd. The Medal of Honor, the highest award for bravery the nation could bestow. It was a concept so far removed from the man they knew as Chief that it bordered on the absurd. They had been taunting a national hero. They had been ordering a decorated veteran to sweep up oats they had kicked over in a fit of pique. The sheer, staggering scale of their misjudgment began to settle upon them, a crushing weight. Crane looked as though he'd been physically struck. His face was ashen, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish out of water. The Congressional Medal of Honor. The words echoed in the cavern of his skull. He tried to reconcile the image of the man in the dirty shirt with the hero the colonel was describing. The effort was too great. His mind simply broke. All the certainty, all the smug superiority that had defined his existence evaporated in an instant, leaving him hollowed out, a brittle shell of a man. Ayanna watched him, his expression unreadable. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a deep, profound sorrow. The revelation was not for his own sake. It was a necessary tool, a key to unlock the conversation that had to happen next. "Colonel," Ayanna said, his voice calm and steady, drawing all attention back to him, "you said there was a fire." "Standing Bear has taken to the warpath," Whitfield said grimly. "His nephew was killed trying to steal cattle from the Morrison Ranch down south. Now he's joined up with Victorio's band. They've crossed the border, and they're riding north, hitting every settlement along the way. They burned the Circle C to the ground. We don't know how many are dead. They move like wraiths, Ayanna. We can't track them. We can't anticipate them. They know this land, and we are blundering through it like fools." The townspeople murmured in terror. The name Victorio was a whispered nightmare in that part of the country, a leader of immense skill and ruthless determination. Whitfield's gaze locked with Ayanna's. "The general sent me personally. He asked me to find you. He knows you are the only one who can reason with them. Or if reason fails, you are the only one who can track them. He needs you, Ayanna. We need you." The request hung in the air, a plea from one world of power to a man who had tried to escape into another. Ayanna let the silence stretch. He looked from the colonel's earnest, worried face to the terrified faces of the townspeople. He saw their fear, their dawning comprehension. But it wasn't enough. They felt the terror of the consequence, but they did not yet understand their role in its creation. They saw the fire, but they did not see the spark that they themselves had lit. He turned his head, and his dark, knowing eyes settled on Thaddeus Crane. Crane flinched, physically cringing under the weight of that gaze. For the first time, he was seeing the man before him. Not the Barnhand, but the diplomat, the warrior, the hero, and he was terrified. "The fire," Ayanna said, his voice quiet but carrying across the entire street, "did not start itself." He took a slow step forward, away from the barn, away from the identity he had worn for 2 years. He moved into the center of the space, a place of judgment. This war did not begin with a stolen cow or a burned-down ranch. It began with an insult. It began right here, in this town. His words were not an accusation. They were a statement of fact, delivered with the cold, irrefutable clarity of a surgeon diagnosing a disease. The climax was not the revelation of who he was. The climax was the revelation of who they were. The true reckoning was about to begin. The sun beat down, turning the dust of the street into a fine, pale powder that clung to everything. The air was thick with the smell of horse, leather, and the sour scent of collective fear. The townspeople of Copper Ridge stood frozen, a tableau of dawning horror, their eyes fixed on the man in the center. He was no longer just Ayanna Two Eagles, decorated scout. In this moment, he had become the conscience of the town, a living embodiment of a truth they had spent their lives ignoring. Thaddeus Crane, hollowed out by the revelation, could only stare. The name Standing Bear had registered in the panicked fog of his mind. He remembered the Apache leader, the dignified man with the pleading eyes, the man he had laughed at. The memory, once a source of smug satisfaction, now felt like a shard of glass in his gut. What do you mean? Crane stammered, the words barely audible. What insult? Ayana's gaze did not waver. It was not a look of anger, but of profound, sorrowful judgment. A month ago, he began, his voice calm and measured, every word chosen with a diplomat's care, but landing with the weight of a judge's gavel. 2 men came to this town, an Apache leader, Standing Bear, and his nephew. They did not come with rifles and war paint. They came in peace. Their people were hungry. The government rations they were promised had, as usual, failed to arrive. The game had been pushed from their lands. They asked for one thing, to trade for grain. He paused, letting the memory surface in the minds of those who had witnessed it. He looked from Crane to Morrison to Pike. He saw the flicker of recognition in their eyes, the dawning sickness. They had good pelts to offer, Ayana continued. They were not begging for charity. They were asking for commerce, an exchange, a simple act of humanity between one group of hungry people and another with full silos. His eyes swept over the silent crowd. I was there. I saw it. I saw you, Mr. Crane, laugh in his face. I saw you, Mr. Pike, spit on the ground before him. I saw the contempt you showed them. You did not just refuse them grain, you refused them their dignity. You told them, with your actions, that their lives were worthless, that their children's hunger was a thing to be mocked. Dutch Morrison, who had been trying to make himself invisible, felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck. He remembered his own snide comment, something about letting them eat dirt. It had seemed clever at the time, a sharp jab to impress Crane. Now, the memory made him feel physically ill. You sent them away with nothing but the poison of your contempt, Ayana said, his voice dropping lower, drawing them in. So they rode south. And what happens to a man who has been denied peace? Who has been told his children must starve, so your own horses can eat well? He let the question hang in the oppressive heat. Desperation, he answered his own question. Desperation leads to desperate acts. The nephew, the young one with hope still in his eyes, tried to steal a cow from a ranch so his family would not starve, and for that, he was shot and killed. A low moan went through the crowd. They were beginning to see the chain of events, the straight, brutal line connecting an act of petty prejudice to a young man's death. And what happens to a leader like Standing Bear? Ayana went on, his gaze now like a physical force, pinning Crane where he stood. When his nephew is killed over a cow, he tried to buy grain to avoid stealing. What happens to a man of peace when he is shown, conclusively, that peace is not an option? He turns to the only path you have left him. He turns to war. He takes his grief and his rage, and he joins with other men who have suffered the same insults, the same injustices, men like Victorio. And he picks up a rifle, and he decides that if you will not allow him to live with dignity, he will teach you to die in fear. He took another slow step toward the 3 men, Crane, Morrison, and Pike, who now stood clustered together, not as a pack of bullies, but as frightened children. That fire on the horizon is not some random act of savage violence, Ayana said, his voice cutting through their defenses. It is the direct and unavoidable consequence of you kicking over a bucket of grain in this barn. He gestured behind him, to the place where it had all happened just hours before. Not literally, metaphorically. You kicked over their bucket. You spat on their worth. You treated them as less than human. And now, that fire is coming this way. The smoke you smell on the wind started in your own hearts. It is the smoke of your pride, your prejudice, your blind, stupid hate. This was the true climax. It was not the threat of Apache warriors that was breaking them. It was the devastating, irrefutable truth that they had brought this upon themselves. It was not a judgment from an external force, from Ayana or the army or the Apaches. It was the heavier, more terrible judgment of their own culpability. Their small, mean-spirited lives, their casual cruelties, were not small at all. They had consequences that burned down ranches and ended lives. The world was not a stage for their petty dramas. It was an interconnected web, and they had just set fire to their own corner of it. Crane's knees felt weak. The entire edifice of his life, his belief in his own rightness, his own importance, had been razed to the ground. He had thought his refusal to trade with the Apaches was a sign of his strength, his control over his town. He saw now that it was an act of world-breaking arrogance. The families missing, the ranches burned, he had a hand in that. Their blood was, in part, on his hands. The thought was so monstrous it threatened to unhinge him completely. "So when you pray tonight," Ayana's voice concluded, soft now, almost a whisper, but more devastating than any shout, "do not pray for the army to save you from the savages. Pray for forgiveness, for what you have done, for the war you have started." He did not need to raise his voice. He did not need to threaten them. He had simply held up a mirror, and the reflection had destroyed them. The confrontation was over. There was no defense, no argument. There was only the quiet, ringing truth, and the shattered men who stood in its wreckage. The moral reckoning was complete. Ayana turned from them then, his back to the broken men, and faced Colonel Whitfield. The transformation was complete. The quiet, contained Barnhand was gone. The weary diplomat and warrior stood in his place, ready to resume a burden he had tried to set down. "Where is the general?" he asked, his voice all business now. "He's moving the main column south to cut off Victorio's retreat to the border," Whitfield replied, his own face etched with a mixture of relief and grim determination. "He sent us here for you. He said you're to be given anything you need. Horses, supplies, men." Ayana nodded, his mind already working, mapping the terrain, calculating distances, thinking in the language of wind and water and trackers' signs. "I will need 3 things," he said. "My own horse. She is old, but she knows me." He glanced toward the last stall where the sway-backed mare stood. It was a statement of loyalty, a small but significant act. A canteen of water, and my saddlebag. Whitfield frowned slightly. "That's it? No men? No rifle?" "The men would only slow me down," Ayana said. "And a rifle is not the first tool one brings to a peace council. Standing Bear knows me. I knew his father. I must first see if words can put out this fire. If they cannot—" He left the sentence unfinished. The implication was clear enough. He was a man who knew how to use other tools when words failed. "It will be as you say," the colonel agreed, his respect for the man's judgment absolute. He turned and barked an order to one of his sergeants, who immediately went to fetch a full canteen. Ayana walked back toward the barn, his steps sure and steady. The townspeople parted before him, their eyes filled with a new and terrifying emotion. Awe. They were looking at him, truly looking at him, for the first time. They saw not the color of his skin, but the content of his character, and the sight was humbling them to the dust. He entered the cool, familiar darkness of the barn. He went to his small, hidden corner where he kept his meager possessions. He pulled out his old, worn saddlebag. From its depths, he retrieved the object wrapped in doeskin. He unwrapped it slowly. The Congressional Medal of Honor glinted dully in the dim light, its blue ribbon a slash of color against the dark leather. He did not look at it. He tucked it deep into an inner pocket of his shirt. It was not a trophy. It was a reminder of a promise to a nation that had not always kept its promises to him, and of a duty he could not shirk. He saddled the old mare, his movements efficient and gentle. She nuzzled his shoulder, sensing the change in him, the call to the road. As he led her out of the barn, he paused by the main aisle. His eyes fell on a small, dusty rail near the entrance. He reached into his pocket and pulled out 3 silver dollar coins. They were his wages for the month, the pay Crane had never bothered to give him. For 2 years, he had endured insults and disrespect. doing his work quietly and honestly. This was what he had earned. He walked over to the rail and placed the 3 coins in a neat row on the wood. They gleamed in a stray shaft of light, 3 small circles of silver in the vast, dusty barn. The act was silent, deliberate, and final. It was not a payment demanded, but a debt marked. It said, "This is all that was between us. This is the material part. It is settled. The rest, the moral debt, is yours to carry. It is a weight far heavier than silver." Without a backward glance at Crane or the others, he led his horse out into the sunlit street. The sergeant handed him the canteen. Colonel Whitfield stood waiting, his hat still in his hand. "Good luck, Ayanna," the colonel said softly. "May the Great Spirit ride with you." Ayanna met his friend's gaze. "And with you, Marcus," he replied. He swung himself into the saddle. He looked neither right nor left at the stunned faces of the people of Copper Ridge. His gaze was fixed on the southern horizon, toward the smoke and the sorrow. He nudged the old mare with his heels, and together they moved down the street and out onto the open plain, a lone rider heading into the crucible, leaving behind a town that had just been irrevocably and painfully reborn. The 3 silver coins remained on the railing in the barn, catching the afternoon light. They were more than money. They were a testament, a lesson, and a silent, permanent reminder of the day the people of Copper Ridge learned that the man they had tried to grind into the dust was the only one tall enough to see over the mountains. The silence Ayanna left in his wake was more profound than the thunder of the cavalry's arrival. It was a vacuum, filled with the rushing thoughts and suffocating shame of the town's citizens. For a long time, no one moved. They stood like statues in the punishing sun, replaying the events, the words, the awful, clarifying truth of the past hour. Finally, Colonel Whitfield placed his hat back on his head, the gesture a signal that the moment of revelation was over and the time for action had returned. He turned his cold gaze back to the town, specifically to Thaddeus Crane. "My men and I will be making camp just outside of town," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "We will require provisions, grain for our horses, food for my men. You will provide them, and you will provide them at a fair price, Mr. Crane. I will be personally inspecting your ledgers. Is that understood?" Crane, who looked as if he had aged 20 years, could only nod dumbly. The threat was clear. The army was now the highest authority in Copper Ridge, and its commander held him in utter contempt. With a crisp command, Whitfield mounted his horse and led his troops out of town to establish their perimeter, leaving the citizens to grapple with their new reality. The crowd slowly began to disperse, not with the usual boisterous gossip, but in small, silent groups, their faces grim. They avoided looking at Crane, Pike, and Morrison. The 3 men who had been the town's locus of power and swagger were now radioactive with shame. They stood alone in the center of the street, isolated by the truth. Crane was the first to move. He walked like a man in a trance, his steps unsteady. He didn't go to his mercantile or the saloon, the seats of his former power. He walked, as if drawn by an invisible string, to the barn. He stepped into the dusty, moat-filled light and saw them. 3 silver coins sitting on the rail. He stared at them. They seemed to burn with a cold fire, his wages. A debt he had been too arrogant and dismissive to pay. Now they felt like the price of his soul. He reached out a trembling hand, but couldn't bring himself to touch them. They were a judgment. He turned and stumbled out of the barn, leaving the coins where they lay. Weeks turned into months. The Apache Fire, as it came to be known, burned across the territory for the rest of that summer. News would trickle back to Copper Ridge, of skirmishes and pursuits, of daring raids and narrow escapes. They heard that Victorio's band had been scattered, but that Standing Bear's group had vanished into the Dragoon Mountains, a natural fortress no army could penetrate. Then, word came that Ayanna Two Eagles had gone into the mountains alone. For weeks, there was nothing but silence. The army waited. The territory held its breath. And then, peace. A treaty had been forged, not in Washington, not in a fort, but in a mountain stronghold, between two men who understood the price of war. Standing Bear and his remaining people were given safe passage to a new reservation, one with better land, and more importantly, with guarantees overseen not by faceless bureaucrats, but by Colonel Whitfield himself, at Ayana's insistence. The war was over. Ayana Two Eagles had, once again, walked between worlds and pulled them back from the brink. He never returned to Copper Ridge. Some said he rode north, back to the lands of his people. Others said he simply vanished, his duty done. But his lesson remained. It settled deep into the bones of the town. The transformation was not sudden or miraculous. It was slow, agonizing, and profound. It began with Thaddeus Crane. The day after the cavalry left, he walked into his own mercantile, took down the sign that read "No Credit," and began the long process of settling his accounts, paying men what they were truly owed, and dealing with a humility that was foreign and painful to him. He started with the small things. He stopped shortchanging the freighters. He paid a fair price for the rancher's cattle. He learned to listen more than he spoke. The arrogance was gone, burned out of him, replaced by a quiet, watchful sobriety. He was a lesser man in stature, but a greater one in character. Samuel Pike, the slow-witted brute, found he no longer had an appetite for cruelty. Without Crane's lead, his own bullying felt hollow and ugly. He quit his position as Crane's enforcer and took a job mucking out the very barn where it had all happened. He found a strange peace in the simple, honest labor. People started to notice that he was gentle with the horses, that he would sometimes leave a handful of his own grain for the wild birds, just as Ayana had. The most visible change was in Dutch Morrison. The sneer was gone forever. He stopped drinking, the alcohol no longer able to numb the memory of his own cringing shame. He began to read. He started with the papers, then books from the territorial library. He became obsessed with the world beyond Copper Ridge, with the treaties and the laws that had been so twisted and broken. Years later, he would become the town's schoolteacher, a man fiercely dedicated to teaching children to question their assumptions, to look at a person's heart before the color of their skin. He taught them that prejudice was not a harmless opinion, but an active poison with devastating consequences. The 3 silver coins were never moved. They became a fixture of the town, a local legend. Crane declared that the barn was to be preserved and the coins left untouched. Newcomers would ask about them, and the old-timers would tell the story. They would tell of the quiet Indian Barnhand who was more than he seemed. They would speak of the day the army came to town, and of the terrible cleansing truth that was spoken in the street. The coins became a touchstone, a permanent, silent reminder. They represented the unacknowledged worth of a good man, the moral debt of a town, and the high price of wisdom. Years passed. The West was changing. The railroad came through, and Copper Ridge grew. But it grew differently than other towns. There was a quietness to it, a thoughtfulness. There was a sense of earned tolerance, a humility that had been seared into its foundation. Fights were rare, and a man was judged by his work and his word. The people of Copper Ridge had learned in the most painful way possible that true power and respect are forged in character and sacrifice, not decreed by social status, wealth, or race. One cool autumn evening, a long time after the fire, an elderly Thaddeus Crane stood at the entrance of the old barn. He was thinner now, his face lined not with anger, but with a deep and abiding melancholy. He looked at the 3 silver coins, their surfaces now dark with tarnish, but their meaning as bright as ever. He thought of Ayana Two Eagles, the man he had wronged so profoundly. He thought of the lesson given not with a fist or a gun, but with the devastating weight of truth, and then with the quiet grace of a man who, with the tables turned, chose education over revenge. A young boy, the son of a new settler, walked by and saw him staring. "What are those, Mr. Crane?" the boy asked, pointing to the coins. Crane looked down at the boy, and for a moment his eyes held the deep, sad wisdom of a man who has been broken and remade. "That," he said, his voice raspy with age, "is the price of our town's soul. It was bought for us a long time ago, by a better man than any of us." He turned and walked away, leaving the boy to stare at the coins, a new generation learning the legend. The sun set, casting long shadows that looked like accusations. But for the first time in a long time, the shadows in Copper Ridge felt less like a haunting and more like a shelter, a place of hard-earned peace, a home built not on pride, but on the enduring, difficult, and beautiful bedrock of respect. The story of Ayana Two Eagles had become their story, a trust they had to earn, one splinter and one scar at a time, for the rest of their days.